So now to really get to the core of this, we're going to talk about banking, and we have to get through this. And this is the last part of this section, and then we will turn in future chapters to the Federal Reserve and inflation. But first, we got to understand banking itself. So John Kenneth Galbraith, he's a Harvard economist. He served under multiple presidents, won 2 Medals of Freedom, was an ambassador, just a larger than life figure, very intelligent gentleman. He said, quote, "The process by which banking creates money is so simple that the mind is repelled." End quote. What do you mean by that? So simple that the mind is repelled. What do you mean the process by which banks create money? Do go on. What are you referring to, Chris? It's a really fascinating thing. And again, I've given talks in public where there's probably must be 10,000 audience members under my belt where I've asked the question, hey, hands up, how many people here were taught how money creation works within the U.S. banking system or any banking system of the West in their schooling, whether it was primary, secondary, college, graduate, I didn't care. Tell me if you were taught about how money is created in the system. And the entire time I've had 2 hands go up. One person went to a college where they had a Marxist professor who understood this stuff, and another was a place where they had a very avant-garde economics professor. But at any rate, most people don't get taught this. And again, not because it's impossible to understand or difficult even, just because it's really important that you understand this. And this is not being taught in colleges. It's not being taught in high schools. And it should be, because again, there is nothing more important than this thing that controls your life, shapes the destiny of who you can be and what you can't be. That if you run out of it, you end up living under a bridge and becoming destitute, maybe committing suicide. Is that much power in our lives? Well, then maybe we understand where it comes from, who's in charge of it, and what the rules around that are. We should learn them, obviously. So here's how money is created in the system. Let's imagine that we've just gone to a whole new dimension. There's no money anywhere in the system, but we have the structure of a banking system at the ready. And so I wander into the story with $1,000 in my pocket. And so I am the first $1,000 to ever come into this system. You're there. Everybody's there. We're all just waiting for some money so we can get that social glue and lubricant going so we can get our economy roaring along. Needs money. I show up. $1,000. What do I do with my $1,000? Well, here we're going to discuss fractional reserve banking. So what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to put my $1,000 in a bank. Sounds good, right? Now I have a bank account for $1,000 and the bank has an offsetting liability, which is my $1,000. My asset is their liability. That's how it works. Now, what could the bank do? Now, according to the rules, the banks can loan out up to 90% of that. They only have to hold a fraction in reserve, 10%. They have to hold 10% in reserve, although we're about to see that's not actually true anymore. But this is how it has been taught conventionally. So this helps us get our minds around it. So let's pretend for the moment in this fictional universe, the fraction that has to be held in reserve is 10%. And the theory underlying that is that, you know what? Everybody doesn't show up for their bank money all at once, So how much do we actually have to hold in reserve in case a lot of people show up all at once? Like happened in 2023 with Silicon Valley Bank, right? Oops, too many people showed up for their money all at once, and the fractional reserve banking system broke down for that regional bank. This is It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart, that 1940s black and white film, wonderful, wonderful film. Again, there's that famous moment he owns a bank where all too many people show up wanting their money back all at once, and they don't have it because they kept just a fraction in reserve. All right. So I take my $1,000, put it in, the bank has it as a liability, it's my asset, and they can loan out 90% of that. They loan out 90% of that to this gentleman who needs to put a roof repair project on his house. Now he takes that $900 and hands it to the roof repairer or I guess an accountant. Let's say he needed some accounting. That looks more like an accountant. So takes that $900, gets his taxes prepared, hands it to the accountant. Now, what does the accountant do with that $900? Well, he puts it in the bank, the same bank, could be the same bank. The bank now has another $900 it can loan out against because it only has to keep 10% of that 900 in reserve. So it can loan out 810, maybe to the same guy. And so on and so on and so on and so on. And when you find out that under a 10% fractional reserve system, $1,000 can be turned into $10,000 of loans within the banking system, which is $10,000 of money, because that $900 given to that accountant, that $900 is real. That's $900. I got $900, my asset. So it turns out that initial $1,000 gets turned into $10,000 of assets and liabilities in the banking system. But where did that $10,000 come from? Where did that extra $9,000 come from? It was loaned into existence, because when did that money actually come into existence? It was when it was loaned to that next person. If you follow this along, you discover that there isn't enough of that original $1,000 to create that $10,000. Where did the rest come from? It was loaned into existence. Now, what do you know about loans? Well, loans have a principal component and an interest component. So you have to pay both of those back, but the interest is what? Well, it's some percentage over a unit of time. Uh-oh. What happens when something grows by some percentage over a unit of time? That's right. It's exponential. So that's a concept. I'm going to connect that dot a little later. You can feel how these threads are starting to come together in this story, I hope. And so we have to talk about this part of interest. Now, I gave this talk, exact talk once back in, I forget, 2007 or something, 6. It was back there. And I had a guy stand up and he was all angry at me because he was an econ professor at UConn. And he said everything I was teaching about money creation was absolutely wrong. And unfortunately for him, I had an indisputable source for all of this information. This right here came from a rock solid, indisputable source, which is that I ordered these comic books from the Federal Reserve. And this is about the story of banks, and they tell how banks work. So it's actually in comic book form at the Federal Reserve, and you can discover that. And so the key concept is this: all money is loaned into existence. That's a really powerful statement. If you could just sit down on a really nice little rug and get into the lotus position and meditate on this statement until it's settled all the way in, you would then have the secret to the future unlocked for you, because this is a powerful statement right here. And let me unpack that for you a little bit. By the way, I just found this out the other day. It's kind of fun here. It turns out as I mentioned, there are actually zero reserve requirements now within the banking system. And it's like, look at this right here. Let me see. I'm going to get, let me get my highlighter here. Yeah, look at this. As announced on March 15, 2020, the board from the Federal Reserve reduced reserve requirement ratios to 0, effective March 26, 2020. This action eliminated reserve requirements for all depository institutions, so now they don't have to hold anything in reserve. So we could go back up to this example, right? And now if somebody there's $1,000 in the bank and somebody wanted to borrow $20 million, okay. As long as the bank feels like that's a good loan to make, they can make that loan. There's no longer any reserve requirements. And now we begin to understand why banks became a little bit riskier, a little bit more thinly capitalized. We understand why we had the bank failures, regional bank failures starting to show up in 2023. It's because of this. This is it. This is the headwaters of the policy Nile. This is where the disaster began. This is where the swampy water began to flow downhill. This is astonishing, right? Why did they do that? So I chased this down a little more. The Federal Reserve did this because they wanted to have actions, they say here, that were going to support the flow of credit to households and businesses. Credit is debt. That's what they mean. Look at this. That's what they did. The Federal Reserve is carefully monitoring credit markets, prepared to use its full range of tools to support the flow of credit to households and businesses, and thereby promote its maximum employment and price stability goals. The flow of credit. Now, what was the emergency that the Fed really needed to support the flow of credit? Well, remember I showed you in 2008 where the little dip in credit almost broke the system. So the Fed's like, oh, we can't have dips in credit. That's a disaster. That would be terrible. But look at this. So this is quarterly change in household debt, and guess what? Every one of those green bars means that debt is growing at household level. Every time there's a red bar, it dipped slightly. Look at this. In 2020, when they made that, March of 2020, they did that because in 2020, in the second quarter right here, just for a tiny second, there was a tiny dip in credit growth in households and the Fed panicked. That was all it took. One single quarter of negative credit growth in households, and the Fed panicked and removed all reserve requirements from banks so they could lend freely. And lend freely they did. Look at this. Woo! Right? That's what it looks like. So this is an astonishing thing. When I say I consider the Federal Reserve to be monetary vandals, it's true, but they're also social vandals. Because when you are constantly doing everything you can to create more and more and more debt in the system without having a single thought about, is there a limit to that? Is this a good idea? Is there anything in the future that might say that all those claims on future stuff, maybe we better be clear that there's a future large enough to support all this new debt creation? They don't think about that. All they think about is this quarter, today, what do we need to do to make sure that we're putting more credit, more debt into the system, because we have a debt-based money system. That's the whole scheme. That's the whole game. All right. So let's look at this then. A feature of loaning money into existence. Remember I said that as an interest and a principal component, right? That interest component. So if you take out a mortgage loan here, right, for instance, take out your mortgage loan. It has obviously those two parts, the loan principal plus expenses plus interest, right? So if we said somebody borrowed $100,000, right? Over time, expenses, taxes, and fees, all that's going to be about $15,000 on that. And over time, at a 2.5% loan rate for 15 years, there would be about $20,000 of interest expense for a total of $135,000 to pay back. So you borrowed $100, but you had to pay back $135. But all the way down here, if you were at a 10% rate of interest on a 30-year loan, you might have borrowed that $100,000, but over time ended up paying back $331,000. So that first $100,000 was printed into existence out of thin air by a bank, clickety-clacketing on a keyboard and handing you that $100,000, which you then bought the house with. And then over time, you're going to pay back on that bottom bar $331,000 to that same bank and also into the system for expenses and things like that. Okay. That's interesting, but but if only 100,000 was loaned into existence for this purchase, where did that other 231,000 come from on the bottom? Where did that money come? Nobody loans that money into existence. So if you're the initial borrower of the 100,000, you got to go out and work. Where's that other 216,000 of interest come from? Where's it come from? Well, a conclusion of this is that in a debt-based money system where you're only loaning out the principal value, but the interest has to come from somewhere, there will always, always, always be more debt in the system than money. That's the conclusion. I could take you through the math, but it's how it works out. So, but that ought to be provable, right? We've been running this system long enough. It ought to be completely obvious that we could look at some data and find out if there is more debt than money in the system. Is that true? Actually, it is. So here we're looking at two pieces of data from the Federal Reserve System. Again, our favorite up top, all sector debt, right? The bottom is M2, which is a broad definition of money. Money might be cash in your wallet. It could be money in your checking account. M2 also includes certificates of deposit that you might have at a bank. It might include money market funds. So M2 is just money in the system. I think you can clearly see there's a lot more debt than money in the system. Just how it is. And by the way, the money's increasing at one rate, but the debt's increasing at another rate. So the debt is accumulating faster than the money. Why is that? It's because a lot of this debt is getting what's called rolled over. It gets compounded on top of itself, and debt includes a principal and an interest component, and the interest is expressed as a percent over a unit of time. You have a loan out, and it's going to have some amount of yearly rate of interest on it, or maybe a monthly rate of interest depending on the type of loan. But it has interest over some percent of time, which means it's right. It's an exponential system by definition. So given this, the debt is a claim on future money, the implicit assumption of seeing constantly growing debt levels is that the economy, future economy, is just going to be exponentially larger than the present economy. There it is. That's it. That's an implicit assumption. Is that a good assumption to make, though? No, it's really not, because you have to assume that the future world and the future world economy is going to be exponentially larger than today. And we're going to take that apart in future episodes, and we're going to show you where that growth, where that future economy where the future resources really come from. And oh boy, is there a story there that's kind of hair-raising in its implications. But debt-based money systems, hey, I think they're a fantastic idea in a world without any resource limits. They're a great idea back in 1913, potentially, when there were still places on the planet that hadn't been explored. A debt-based money system today, in today's world, where we have 8+ billion people, where we pretty much mapped out all the major resource finds, and we know exactly how much of those things are there, and that primary and secondary wealth is actually the true wealth against which we're actually using our money system is just a marker, right? The idea that we are not thinking this through and constantly growing our debt-based money system faster and faster and faster and faster without a single apparent thought about the idea that debt-based money system, it's not the reality. It's just a claim. It's just a marker on real wealth. What's real wealth? We've been through this. It's primary wealth. It's secondary wealth. It's real things. Oh, how many of those real things are there? And is there a possibility that we could grow those exponentially to meet this ever exponential rising amount of claims, which is the debt in the system? Do these things connect at all? And the answer is no, they don't, not even remotely, not even a tiny bit, right? So this is all something that we need to talk about, and that's why we're talking about it, because they're not really talking about it, even though Jerome Powell let slip what everybody should be talking about, because it's just blindingly obvious that the current run rate of debt accumulation in the United States, but also for the world, is completely unsustainable. And that has enormous implications for how the future is going to unfold, what's going to be valuable, what's not going to be valuable, and where we all should be applying our efforts and our attention going forward. So up next, Chapter 3. Thank you so much for making it this far. Chapter 3 is going to be about the Fed, money printing, and inflation, because we're going to go to the headwaters of the Nile. Where does that first $1,000 come from? And also inflation. How do we think about it? How do we understand it? It's a really important chapter. And with that, you're going to have this foundation that we're sharing together. And thank you so much for making it this far. Congratulations for getting all the way through this long, involved, but hopefully important, gripping chapter, because this is really important stuff, folks. And once we get the foundation, we can have a shared conversation about the implications of this stuff. Again, this is just common sense. It's staring us all in the face. For some reason, the culture doesn't seem to want to have this discussion. Most people seem to want to turn away from it. You're not one of those people, because you know that information that you can use and context you can use is actually the most important and powerful device you can accumulate for yourself. But again, information without action doesn't do much, right? So we are going to be talking about all of this, every one of these chapters here now that I'm talking about with you here today. Will also have a corresponding chapter that sits over at Peak Prosperity. And this, I will take the conclusions from this and draw it into current events. And so whenever time you're watching this, it will be at some point in the future, potentially, if you're watching this far in the future, we will be having corresponding conversations around the implications off of this chapter. This is what we're going to be talking about most recently, and we'll carry on with all of that. So thank you very much for listening today. Please, I hope you make use of this information, and I've been very happy to be putting this information back together for you here out in the world. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye.
The beauty of saying it's an emergency is very difficult to challenge any of this stuff.
Our wealth is being stolen via our money.
I would have never come here if I thought it was lost. I know we can